Hello, my name is Tamara Daily. I'm a professor of psychology, neuroscience, and human development at the University of Mount Union. This video is a slightly longer version of a presentation I gave at the Spring Faculty Research Forum at the University of Mount Union on February 22nd, 2022. The presentation covers my sabbatical research where I did an exploratory study of the experiences of people who provide foster care for rescued dogs. This project, and I will pause here and say that each of the images in this presentation are of dogs that I have fostered over the last few years in my work as a volunteer foster provider. So this project came out of a combination of both my personal interests as a person who provides foster care, but also my professional interests as a social psychologist. As a researcher, I am interested in the human-animal bond and in human-animal interactions generally, and I've done some other research projects in that area, especially in collaboration with my colleague, Dr. Melissa Muller. As a social psychologist, I'm interested in how people talk about and write about their experiences, how they talk about and write about their attitudes and values. I do a fair amount of qualitative research, especially thematic content analysis. So I like to incorporate that kind of methodology whenever I can. I foster dogs for a Labrador Retriever rescue in Northeast Ohio. The organization is one where I adopted a dog that was a part of our family for 15 years and felt like I could do something to give back to that organization. Our current dog also came to us via a courtesy post with that same organization. My goal with this project was the hope that I would be able to encourage others to do more research and into the role that volunteers play in dog rescue and animal rescue more broadly, with an eye toward trying to improve the process of recruiting and training and providing support to foster providers so that they can keep performing their role long term. So we start with the question of why do people foster animals, and why should we study them? So first off, why is it necessary to have foster providers for animals in the first place? Rescued animals quite often, as I've learned in my role as a foster provider, they quite often have behavioral issues. They sometimes have health issues. They sometimes have both. Sometimes they have psychological trauma that needs to be addressed before we can make them more fully adoptable. Volunteers, by becoming foster providers and taking animals into their homes, are able to do a more long-term assessment, a better job of kind of incorporating these animals into their day-to-day home life, therefore making them more ready for adoption to a permanent home. One thing I found as I started this project was that the experiences of volunteers who provide care work for animal rescue or animal care in general haven't really been studied in any kind of detail. There has been some research literature on veterinary professionals, actually a fairly substantial amount of research there, but studying volunteers who do this work has not been something that I could find evidence had been studied. So when I looked at the literature, what did I find? I found some privately, although not published in a peer-reviewed journal. I found some privately produced research that noted what we could all, if you have any connection to the animal rescue world, you know this already, recruiting and retaining volunteers, especially those who provide foster and other kinds of care to animals, is difficult. And it's difficult to keep those people around for the long haul. We also have lots of anecdotal reports in the care work literature, whether it's caring for humans or caring for animals, that the work of care is simultaneously rewarding but very difficult and can lead to physical and psychological stress and has been found to be correlated with negative outcomes. Now, most of this research has been done in the human care field. There is some evidence of the same kind of patterns among veterinary professionals, both veterinarians and people who provide support roles in veterinary offices. There's also, the logical conclusion that the health and well-being of animals is going to be affected, and vice versa, by the health and well-being of the humans who provide the care. The research on that relationship between the cared for and the person doing the care work, the primary empirical evidence comes from the medical literature of people who provide care for other people. We can make the same kind of prediction in care work for animals as well. My research questions, I had qualitative questions and I had quantitative questions. And for the record, I'm looking at this picture. This was the foster dog that we had the longest in our home. His name is Smokey. He is almost completely blind and loves to chase cars. After a long time with us, we finally were able to identify a wonderful home for him where he gets to be the best friend of a delightful little girl. Anyway, my qualitative questions, and these were questions that participants were able to answer longhand by writing out their thoughts. I wanted to know what motivated them to get involved in foster care in the first place. I wanted to know what the most rewarding aspects of the experience were, what they saw as most challenging issues, and then if they'd stopped fostering, why had that happened. On the quantitative side, I was interested in finding out if some of the same patterns of correlations were evident in care providers for animals that have been seen in the medical literature. I looked at compassion satisfaction and then compassion fatigue, which is made up of burnout and secondary traumatic stress. And I also used a measure of what's called eudaimonic well-being. My second quantitative question I actually wasn't able to answer. I wanted to compare current and former foster providers, but I had an insufficient number of individuals who were former foster providers to make valid comparisons there. My participants, I had 85 participants total who completed the questionnaire. On the qualitative side, not everybody completed all of the instruments for the quantitative questions, but the 85 actually completed all of the qualitative questions. Most were currently fostering. I had a small percentage of individuals who were former foster providers. Most of the participants were women, and the overwhelming majority were white. The age range was between 25 and 64, with the most common group of people being between 45 and 54. The majority of the participants reported serving in more than one role within their organization, and most were involved in some kind of non-breed specific organization, although many did report being connected to a breed-specific organization. A much smaller number were working with pounds or other kinds of established shelters, such as the Humane Society, for example. The majority of the participants had been involved for less than 5 years. A substantial number had been involved, so 23% had been involved for 6 to 10 years, and then a somewhat smaller group had been involved for more than 10 years. I constructed a survey to be delivered online through SurveyMonkey. It was constructed to include an informed consent form, open-ended questions, and scales, which were modified to fit the specific needs of the study. So for example, in the professional quality of life scale, I had to change the wording so that it indicated I wanted them to be thinking about their role as a foster provider for dogs. Same for volunteer functions and for self-care. So the self-care assessment for psychologists was designed obviously for psychologists. So I changed the language in each question. So instead of saying, in your work with as a psychologist, I put it in your work as a foster provider for dogs. The procedure, I'll start with the design. The design, this was an exploratory study, meaning my goal was to look at what's out there, since there's no research that's been done systematically looking at the experiences of foster providers for dogs. I want to look and see what's there in hopes of being able to generate further hypotheses later down the road. My specific hypotheses were descriptive. I wanted to describe what patterns were in existence. I had some correlational hypotheses that were grounded in the previous research on medical professionals. The open-ended qualitative questions were assessed using thematic content analysis, using more or less a grounded theory approach. The procedure, very straightforward. If you've ever filled out an online survey, you know how this works. Participants followed the link, which was posted on various social media sites, and the link was also emailed to some organizations directly. They clicked on the link, it took them directly to the informed consent. If they agreed to participate, they completed the survey, finishing up with a debriefing statement with all of my contact information. So on the qualitative side, and these images, yes, that's me. These were two of the most damaged, traumatized dogs I have had in my care thus far. These were both puppy mill refugees who came to us shut down in poor condition, more psychologically poor condition than physically. For this dog who came in under the name of Rachel, and eventually she had several different names. I called her Dolly. I was her third foster care provider. Some of the heavy lifting was done by a foster before me who gave her time to decompress and learn to trust people fairly well. Then she came to me because I live in a neighborhood where she could get more exposure to people and try to learn how to live in a world that is populated by lots of people. This second image is of a dog who came in under the name of Hershey, which I refuse to call a chocolate Labrador Hershey, just on principle. So one of my kids dubbed her Holly. She spent most of the first 2 weeks in my home hiding in a corner, pretty much terrified. Both these dogs, when they were frightened, would involuntarily lose control of bladder and bowel. Just petrified dogs who knew nothing of the world. The image here, yes, that's my bathrobe, was the first time after 2 weeks that this dog flopped her head over into my lap after my using every morning to sit and drink my coffee sitting next to her. Now, listening to me tell that story is very much like some of the stories that foster providers told when they wrote their responses to me on their surveys. The most common reason that people gave for wanting to foster dogs was to save their lives and to help them. Many people talked about, really loving dogs and liking being with dogs, liking meeting new dogs, and liking the challenge of trying to meet their needs and figure them out and get them ready for a new home. But clearly the global goal that most people talked about was that they just really wanted to help dogs and save their lives. The most prominent reward that was discussed was just really loving seeing them go to permanent homes with people who were a good fit for them and who would love them and care for them for a long time. The fact that we as foster providers get to know these dogs and get to know them pretty well. Our big challenge is finding a place where they're not going to get disrupted again. A lot of people talked about that. Some people talked about the joy of just being entertained by all of the different unique characteristics of these dogs. Some people talked about enjoying the challenge of trying to deal with their issues and bring them around and watch them flourish. That idea of flourishing came up a lot, watching them come out of their shells, watching them figure out how to navigate a world with people. I definitely, with Holly, I remember very crystal clear the first time she decided to play with my dog. That's a real breakthrough moment for some of these puppy mill dogs, where they will open up to another dog and behave, just act like a dog, because all they've done their whole lives is, for these females, is make babies. On the downside, there are definitely difficulties. There are physical issues, there are problem behaviors. Many of these dogs, some of us say, there's a reason dogs are in rescue. Usually it's because of failures on the part of people in their lives. Sometimes it's intentional abuse, sometimes it's unintentional, sometimes it's through no fault of their own. We've had dogs come into our rescue because their owners died or became ill and couldn't care for them any longer. So there's any number of reasons, but regardless, we often face dogs with pretty significant problems. Sometimes their problems make them very difficult to manage in your house. Many of the dogs we take in are not housebroken, or they're imperfectly housebroken. Many of them, especially during the COVID years, had separation anxiety issues because they've never been alone. Many of them are poorly socialized with other animals and don't know how to behave properly. Most of them don't have basic obedience skills, and have not been taught appropriate boundaries with people. So the most common issue that people talked about was problem behaviors. There were also people who talked about the real difficulty on their own psychological side of seeing traumatized dogs, seeing them suffer, seeing them shake in anxiety, seeing them act out or just really struggle. That hurts people. They also talked about how when the dogs were ill, for instance, if they have heartworm or they have other diseases that are so obviously preventable, how angry that makes them, angry at the people who let it happen, upset and heartbroken by the pain and suffering that they're experiencing, and so on. So there are a lot of those kind of psychological experiences that fosters go through when they're thinking about the difficulties that their dogs are facing. There were also several of the people in my sample who talked about the fact that they had dogs who died in their care. Sometimes this was because they had to be euthanized. It's a fact of rescue life that there are times when the behavior of a dog that's brought into rescue means that it cannot be placed with a family, or it can't be placed, period. If dogs bite humans, it's highly unlikely that we can place them anywhere. So there's that trauma that people have to deal with, the decision making that led up to it. Sometimes people talk about feeling guilty, feeling angry, feeling powerless to stop those kinds of things. Other participants wrote about how they had puppies come in with preventable diseases that were so advanced that they could not be saved, and then watching one after another die was just overwhelming for them. I had one foster who came in who was in very bad physical condition. That was pretty tough. Although, some decent food, some good pain relief, some arthritis medicine, and he was a fetching machine, that's for sure. Now, when people responded to the question about no longer fostering, despite the wording of the question being crystal clear, most participants responded that they were still fostering. So, ignoring those responses, those who had stopped, the number one reason was because they no longer had any room in their house for any more dogs. And the most common reason for that was because they had adopted one of their fosters or more than one of their fosters. In the biz, this is called foster failure. And while it is a good thing for the individual dogs that get adopted into the right home, it's not a good thing necessarily for the rescue, because then that foster provider is no longer available to foster more dogs. Sometimes the reasons for leaving had to do with the behavior of the resident dogs. Sometimes they just stopped being tolerant of new dogs coming into their space all the time. And I can tell, my own dog is getting older. She's a little less and less tolerant as the years go by of having new dogs come into her home. And this was primarily because, at one point she was she was aggressively responded to by one of the fosters in my care, and that has made her quite suspicious of dogs. It takes her a little bit longer these days to warm up. So some fosters noted that their resident dogs had become aggressive or had become uncomfortable with having other dogs in the home. For some, they reported just not being able to deal with some of the emotion that was connected to the relationships within the rescues. But far and away, the most common reason, they just didn't have room in their house for any more dogs. And the biggest connecting reason for that was that they had adopted the dogs in their care. On the quantitative side, as expected, and this was what has been found in the medical literature, people who experience higher levels of burnout in their workplace tend to feel less satisfied with the work that they do. So when asking this same set of questions to foster providers of dogs, you have participants who were reporting higher levels of burnout also felt less satisfied with their work as a foster care provider. Also, echoing the findings from the medical field, burnout and secondary traumatic stress, which is one component of compassion fatigue, were positively correlated, which means that as secondary traumatic stress scores go up, so does the level of burnout, and vice versa. Some interesting results that really kind of connected well with the qualitative data was that compassion satisfaction was predicted by certain elements of the reasons why people were attracted to volunteer work. So on the volunteer functions inventory, responding to those items and suggesting that the volunteer work itself, was connected to personal growth and development. It was connected to identity. It was connected to, social connections and social interactions and even friendships. So if the function of volunteering had clear identity-related roles for the person, their compassion satisfaction scores tended to go up. And, remember correlational results, they're bidirectional. So it's not clear what the causal connection is there. For self-care, when people reported using more self-care techniques, things like getting exercise, eating well, getting rest, taking breaks, talking out their concerns with other people in relation to their work, their compassion satisfaction scores go up. On the flip side of that, burnout and secondary traumatic stress were negatively associated with self-care. So when people used fewer self-care tactics, their scores on burnout and STS went up. So that, and some of those things from those last two bullet points really connected with some of the statements that people gave about their experiences in the open-ended questions. So, when people talk about the drudgery, the repetitiveness of, every new puppy mill dog has some of the same problems, or every one of these heartworm dogs, you go through the same thing over and over again with these dogs, that can lead to burnout if people are not using appropriate self-care measures, and if their orientation to the work isn't grounded in the work itself, but is instead grounded perhaps in simply loving dogs. So for example, if people's primary reason for wanting to be engaged as a foster provider for dogs is just because they love dogs and maybe want more dogs, they love dogs in their lives, but they're not committed to the full kind of work of rescue as it relates to their own identity and their own personal development, they may be at more risk for burnout and STS, because they're in it because they love dogs and they love being with dogs. What they aren't in it for necessarily is the long-term grind of care work. So when people came into these volunteer roles committed to the care work itself, that tends to be a protection against burnout and STS. So some conclusions that you can take home from this presentation, and this image is from my Instagram feed from just this past Saturday night, where I knew that the very next morning I was going to be sending off my most recent foster dog, Max, to his new home. He was a lovely dog, and under any other circumstances I would have happily kept him in my home, but I know he's going to a really great place, and he's going to be loved and have fun and have meaningful work. So take-home messages: care work comes packaged with it risk and protective factors. And it doesn't matter whether you're doing care work with animals or you're doing care work with people. There are things that doing that work puts you at risk, and there are things that can protect you as you're doing that work. Many respondents talk to the potential for damaging experiences. And having done this work now for, I think I'm on dog 14, or yeah, I think 14. There are potentially damaging stressors, and I've learned to set boundaries and to make sure that I take care of myself and that I connect with my contacts and my friends within the rescue to vent if I need to vent, or to ask questions if I need to ask questions. And I take breaks when I know that I need them, and then when I know that my resident dog or my family needs breaks as well. So you have to be aware of the potential for these damaging stressors. At the same time, recognizing that there are positives for growth and for making connections to people is essential as a protective factor. So one thing that I learned looking at the responses of my participants was that they often talked about what they learned about not just dogs and dog training, but what they learned about themselves, what they learned about the world, what they learned about other people who do this kind of work, and the social connections and friendships that they've made as a result of doing the volunteer work that they do. So there are positives, there are negatives, and the orientation you have to the work kind of sets you up for whether or not you're going to come out on the side of the stressors or come out on the side of personal growth and social connection. For those who work in leadership, I think the takeaway message, at least in this preliminary stage of research like this, is that it may be helpful for rescue leaders to pay some special attention to in their discussions with potential volunteers, and ongoing discussions with their volunteers, talk to them about the risks in fostering and talk to them about the benefits as well. It may be helpful to develop and design some training that can help fosters to think about self-care more directly and more actively, as well as, more of the kind of tactical training for how to cope with certain kinds of problem behaviors in the animals that they're working with. So a final comment, it may be beneficial to give some instruction or to build in opportunities for self-care. One of the things the rescue that I'm involved with has done is to create a private Facebook group. And while most of the time it's just us sharing pictures of the goofy thing our most recent foster has done, that is a real self-care outlet. It's a way of saying, look, here I am, I'm working with this foster, here's this thing that they did. Sometimes you're sharing hard stuff. Sometimes you're talking about, the struggle you had with the dog this week. Sometimes you're sharing a little victory. Sometimes you're sharing a frustration. That's an example of a mitigation strategy that can help reduce stress and help people to kind of understand the steps that they're taking along the way. So I suppose I'm struggling to have a nice parting comment. I'll just sum up by saying, as is the case in care work generally, and I'm sure that you're connecting some dots here with what we've seen over the course of the pandemic with nurses and doctors and other kinds of caregivers who are just stressed and broken by taking care of people who are sick with COVID-19. We've learned that burnout and secondary traumatic stress are major issues for care work. I think what this research demonstrates is the need to study more fully and more carefully, more systematically, the experiences of people who do care work with animals. There's been some research done on veterinary professionals. Now we need to extend it further into the volunteer world, in addition to the paid work world in work with animals. And these are the references that I referred to over the course of the presentation. Thank you for listening.